Hey everybody, today we're going to take a look at the very first Atari Flashback plug-and-play system. This was patterned to look like an Atari 7800, an unusual choice since the 2600 was far more popular. I am a 7800 fan though, so I'm cool with that. It is miniaturized. I can fit my whole hand around it. You have a power button and a reset button on the system itself. You also have your RCA video audio cables with mono audio and an AC adapter that has a decent length cord as well. It also came with two controllers that you can plug into the system. The system does not work with standard Atari controllers, and this controller does not work with Atari systems either, even though it looks like it might. This is patterned after the Atari 7800 Proline controllers. It's miniaturized once again. You have the two buttons on the side. You also have a pause and select button as well. So let's go ahead and take the Atari Flashback, hook it up, and see how it holds up today. Let's go to the games. The very first Atari Flashback was released by Atari way back in 2004. When you turn on the system, you are greeted with a menu screen which features two stacks of generic cartridges. You can navigate between them using up and down on the joystick. Highlighted cartridges will tell you the name of the game. If you select the cartridge port on the system itself in the middle of the screen, you will get a very tiny bio on the Atari 7800. You can pick a game with the controller, but once a game is picked, you will need to hit reset on the system to return to the system menu. The system uses NES on a chip technology, so while the games are based on Atari 2600 and 7800 games, they were remade for an NES style system, meaning the graphics and sounds are different from the originals. There are 20 games included. The first game is based on the Atari 2600 classic Adventure. Adventure's like pizza, where it's almost always good no matter what system it's on. This version is one of the weaker versions, as simply moving your square felt off at times and seemed to move at different speeds, but the game is still enjoyable enough to play. The second game is based on Air-Sea Battle for the 2600. This target shooting game was never that great in my opinion, and this version does little for me. It also took me a while to figure out that in the single player game, you had to use the second player controller. The third game is based on the Atari 7800 version of Asteroids. While this version somewhat resembles the Atari 7800 version, it clearly is not. The graphics are not as good, and moving is a joke. It's almost like you're moving on little patches of ice, and the feeling of momentum is pretty much gone. The fourth game is based on Battlezone for the 2600. I really like the 2600 version of Battlezone, and this version is okay, but the difficulty is way too hard as enemies often appear right in front of you. The fifth game is based on the Atari 2600 paddle controller game Breakout. Having a paddle game use a joystick is almost never a good idea. This version of Breakout plays okay with the joystick, but you're still not going to get too far without the paddle controllers, which of course you cannot use with this system. The sixth game is based on Canyon Bomber, another 2600 paddle game, and like Air-Sea Battle, it's another game that never really impressed me all that much, and this version does nothing to change my mind. The seventh game is based on the Atari 7800 version of Centipede. Even though it's nowhere near as good as the original 7800 version, this version of Centipede is somewhat playable and enjoyable. The eighth game is based on the 2600 version of Crystal Castles, and boy does this one suffer. It has the look of the 2600 version, but the controls are absolutely horrendous, as I constantly got stuck trying to move around corners. The ninth game is based on the Atari 7800 game Desert Falcon. I really enjoyed the Zaxxon style game on the Atari 7800, but this port really disappoints. The NES has trouble using a lot of sprites, something that the 7800 could easily do, and in this version we have flicker all over the place. It takes a solid game on the 7800 and makes it nearly unplayable. The 10th game is based on the 7800 classic Food Fight. I'm glad Food Fight is on the system simply because it's one of those games that deserves more attention, and while this version is nowhere near as good as the 7800 version, I still had some fun with it. The 11th game is based on the 2600 version of Gravitar, a game that requires precision controls to play, which is exactly what this version is missing. The 12th game is based on the 2600 classic Haunted House. I like Haunted House on 2600, and just like Adventure, I can enjoy it on this system, but it's not nearly as good as the 2600 version and is sorely missing the iconic sounds and music. The 13th game is based on Millipede for the 2600. Like Centipede, this is one of the more playable games on this plug and play, and I actually think this version is easier than the 2600 version, but of course not as good. The 14th game is based on Planet Smashers for the 7800. In this version of Planet Smashers, I found it easier to upgrade my weapons, but the weapon upgrades are more limited. It also seems like it takes longer to get to the end of level bosses, and they seem much more difficult as well. Basically, this is an okay port, but not as good as the original. The 15th game is based on the unreleased Howard Scott Warshaw game Saboteur for the 2600, which almost became a 2600 game based on the TV show The A-Team. This version is a mess to play, and I'm assuming the prototype itself is much more playable. The 16th game is based on Skydiver for the 2600, but this version doesn't even get the splat right. How can you not get the splat right? The 17th game is based on Solaris for the 2600. It's a passable space shooter and one of the more playable games on the system, although I'm sure the original is better. The 18th game is based on Sprintmaster for the 2600. It was very hard to control your car in the 2600 version, but it's even harder to control here, so be prepared to either pass on this one or face lots of frustration. The 19th game is based on Warlords, the popular paddle game for the 2600. Once again, this is one of those games where this version is playable but not nearly as good as the 2600 version. The 20th and final game is based on the all-time classic Yars Revenge for the 2600. This might be one of the better games on this plug and play, but it still has some problems, including the ability at times to go past the enemy shield. So say it with me, everybody. It's good, but not as good as the original. Graphically speaking, the system does an okay job with the 2600 game graphics, but for the most part it ends up making the Atari 7800 look like a graphical powerhouse compared to the NES. Sound and music wise is where the system really flounders. It seems like there are several sounds that are either missing, muted, or far too different from the original. It's one of those things that might bother you a whole lot more if you're pretty familiar with the original games. Family friendly wise, even though the game system wasn't rated when it came out, I assume it would get an E for everyone rating it for release today. At the time I researched on eBay including shipping, used systems were going for around $10 to $20. So what did I think of the original Atari Flashback? While I'm glad that the Atari 7800 got some attention out of the system, I wish it would have better represented how great the Atari 7800 can be. I've heard that some people find these controllers comfortable, but personally the small size cramped my hands even more than the originals. I like that they have a pause and select button on them, but I wish you could return to the main menu just using the controller. Perhaps when you pause the game, having an option to do so would have been nice. Control-wise, the joysticks weren't the greatest, but they were okay. But overall, I found this system severely lacking due to the graphical and sound limitations. It almost feels like a pirated system you would pick up at a suspicious booth in a flea market. Now, this is somewhat understandable due to the fact that the people behind the system were only given 10 weeks to make it, which simply is not enough time to port 20 games made for the Atari 2600 and 7800 to NES on a chip technology. I'm grateful that this led to other flashbacks, even those for other systems, but overall there is very little reason to pick up the system unless you're a collector of such things. So where am I going to rank the first version of the Atari Flashback? This one's going to be pretty low since I can't really recommend it. I'm looking around the 17 rank, where the Activision plug and play currently is, and that also featured poorly ported Atari 2600 games. Since the Flashback controls better and has more games, I will put it over the Activision one. So out of the 26 plug and plays I've now ranked, the original Atari Flashback is backing into the 17th position in a flash. The first Atari Flashback may have started a big line of plug and plays, but it definitely wasn't a strong start. At least that's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Also, please click like and subscribe and follow me both on the Facebook or the Twitter. I'm also a member of the Retro Junkies Network. At this time, I'd like to thank all of my extraordinary Patreon supporters who voted for me to review this plug and play today. Thank you all. If you'd like to support the show and gain access to exclusive content, you could do so by signing up at patreon.com/NoSwearGamer. Thank you for giving me a little part of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the next episode of the No Swear Gamer. Take care, and if you can, go play a real Atari 7800.